everybody. Welcome back to Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers. And I am Dana Litwin, as hopefully you all know by now, subscribers and new viewers. And I am very, very delighted to welcome back to the channel Lisa Marie Mooney, MA, CVA, fellow CVA amongst us. And thanks for coming back to the channel, Lisa. I'm so glad to have you back. Your Iron Hug Tuesday tips from a few years ago has been one of the most popular, and I look forward to more conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad people are listening into the Iron Hug. I still use it.
Yeah, it's still valuable. Boundaries, Iron Hug. You know, firm, polite, but compassionate and respectful. We love a good Iron Hug. But more importantly, I wanted to have you back because you and I, with many other leaders of volunteers, worked on developing a toolkit over this last spring and summer for ADEVI Part 2, Electric Boogaloo is the joke that I make with Faiza and Mark, who are leading that. And that stands for Assessing Diversity and Equity in Volunteer Involvement. And this is, again, year 2 of this research that's been funded by AmeriCorps and some other generous grants that Faiza Van Zandt, the executive director of CCVA and good friend and colleague of ours, has been leading with Professor Mark Hager from Arizona State University and a couple of great grad students whose names might come up in the topic. But I was on one kind of working group, and you were on a different working group of several to develop what are turning into a few dozen different tools that are currently also going through their own updates and iterations. So why don't you tell us all at home a little bit about your experience on your working group and what specific topic your team helped do and the tools that you developed?
Yeah, so they had sort of approached us with a bit of a divide in the topics around the core competencies for volunteer administrators based on the CCVA and their research in core competencies that volunteer administrators should have, which was basically around volunteer retention. Retention is really hard, I think, because one of the issues I have personally with retention is that you really need to retain volunteers throughout the entire life cycle.
Exactly.
To me, though, retention is on the circle of their life. Well, now they're here. Like, so you're retaining them. After they apply, are they responding back to your inquiries about the volunteer role? Like, did they come to the interview? Like, after they were interviewed, did they, there are so many steps and portions in the volunteer life cycle where you can lose someone. You really need to be thinking about retention, like, holistically. So one of the tools we did create, I think this group actually has 2 tools out. So we do have one tool that can be used at any point during a volunteer's life cycle. And then with the other tool that we put out right now, it's really kind of focused with what sort of the demand of thinking about the stereotypical retention of, we're all asked at some point. You would be hard pressed to find a volunteer administrator, leader of volunteers who hasn't been asked by somebody, well, what's our retention?
Yeah. Like, what's our rate? What's our percentages? What are our numbers?
Sticking over year. And it's like, for me, I hate that question. I spent quite a few years at a different organization before the one I'm at now, where I lived in a very transient city. Like, people would move to our city. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. So I'm remote from Maryland on the call today, but I worked in Washington, D.C. prior to my remote job. And, DC is a place that people, come for college, they come for grad school, they come for fellowships at different, there's so many different kinds of organizations here and federal agencies. And there's so much opportunity for people to come to DC for a stint, for a period of time. And then after that period of time ends and they take advantage and they maximize like everything they can do in the area, they leave. And so all of those people who came and volunteered and met our requirements, did the commitment of volunteering that we advertise on our website, and then go, that's a loss in our retention rate. That never sat well with me. So the Defining Volunteer Retention worksheet is sort of like the official title of this tool.
The Defining Volunteer Retention worksheet, because context matters. And so if you're in an area like DC where like you said, people are coming because of fellowships, because of grants, because of science projects, because of political appointments, or working for different staff members. Like you said, there's a lot of reasons that very skilled, highly specialized experts in things come to live for a period of time and then move on. And that shouldn't reflect badly on an organization if the climate scientist that was there in 2024 isn't there in 2025 and can't bring the research team to come and volunteer at the organization this year because they've moved on. They've moved on to something different, and that's the nature of the localized area you're in versus, maybe some other cities or metropolitan areas where volunteering is more consistent and people live there. And I think that also can tie into, and we'll talk more about the tool in a second, but the recent 2024 AmeriCorps research on volunteering identified metropolitan areas, urban areas, where volunteering was in general up and where volunteering was in general down at or still lower than pre-2020 pandemic levels, with that disruption that's ongoing, but that initial shock to the system. And DC was one of the ones where volunteering was lower. And that makes me think, with this context of this tool and your own experiences, that what's the whole story? What's that holistic look at retention? Is it really down, or is it more that we can't cite the same people over and over again because it's an election year and administration's just flipped over and a lot of people are scattered into different jobs and moving into new jobs at this, not just the people that are in the news every day, but there are, dozens and hundreds and sometimes thousands of support staff that are, and other businesses and other jobs that are impacted by changes in administration. So I'm wondering how that might factor into it. Please tell us about the tool.
And a lot of volunteer opportunities, and I know my example is DC, but I really think the concept behind this is really applicable anywhere, because most volunteer opportunities do have some sort of minimum commitment. There's an ask you're putting out there. So you could be in an environment where you have some sort of regular, repetitive volunteerism over a period of time. So you could be phrasing it like it's a 6-month commitment. Within that 6 month, you need to volunteer 50 hours within the 6 months. Well, if somebody does the 50 hours within that 6 months and completes the commitment and then chooses to go on and do something different, they've met your minimum commitment, right? So that's all you've asked of them in this sort of agreement, or the advertisement you put out there is that a negative in your number if somebody chooses to leave after they do that minimum commitment, right? So there's a lot of questions on the tool that are meant to be there to inspire sort of brainstorming and thinking about, well, what are we really asking of these people? And then what do we want people to gain from the experience? And if they're giving us what we've asked and they're leaving and taking away something about our organization, they've gained something, they're doing something else related to our mission and vision after they leave, or they become donors, or something else, I argue that is a form of retention, right? So what do we want to go back to those leaders at our organization and say about retention? Maybe we want to talk about conversion rates of people who became donors because they volunteered. We want to talk about people who maybe left but went to grad school doing some sort of work like related to what they did as a volunteer in our organization. So there's so many different ways that you could talk about it versus we have 18% loss of these specific people who aren't coming in and doing this kind of volunteerism anymore, even though they may have met the minimum requirements. There's also thinking about this by the role at your organization and not looking at your numbers holistically. Because if you're a very dynamic organization that has regular volunteerism, but you also have one-day events, and you are tracking the people at your one-day events, and the only commitment you've asked of them is to do this one-day event and they never come back, and you're showing all this like high loss statistic mixed in with some of your repetitive volunteerism, it really throws off. It's not really showing a proper representation. Also, doing it by role can point out maybe some roles where you truly are having some issues. That's not to say you might not have retention issues, right? You might find out, like, I'm doing this, I'm thinking about this, I'm doing this worksheet, maybe by role, and I'm seeing this one particular role really does have some sort of barrier or hurdle, or there's some reason people aren't completing the requirement or the ask that we have of them. And what can we do about this role? It's really important we have volunteers in this capacity, but something's missing and it's not connecting with the volunteers that we're bringing in, and we're not retaining them. They're not finishing the commitment. They are dissatisfied.
Yeah, and I found that working with a client recently where they want people with a specific life experience on a warm line, on a crisis line, and they have a lot of returning volunteers who've been doing this work for years, but they want people who've been in similar lived situations as parents, as caregivers, like whether they're birth parents or not, but just they want that. But they only had, and this is a point I pointed out and that they're fixing for next year, but I worked with them on their recruitment last year, and we recruited the ideal number of people for the initial cohort that we wanted, but then dropped 25% of them because the agency was not yet able to change the training time from it has to be these specific weekends in October at these specific times. And it's like, well, if you want parents and caregivers to show up and learn how to do this, maybe having one inflexible training weekend per year, because clearly now we have the data, which never been recorded before, but now we have the context and the holistic picture that these people were otherwise qualified and wanted to do it. And this was the exact barrier that stopped them from joining this important role and being a part of it. And they can be encouraged to come to one-day events or other things that fit in their schedule. But you got so far along spending their time and your time to have that be the last hurdle that they couldn't cross, that that's something that's worth changing and making more accessible and flexible for folks to participate for a fully remote role. And they insisted on in-person training. It's like, these are fully remote roles. We can Zoom train. It's sometimes something that isn't obvious until you maybe use a tool like you help develop with your team and your working group for people to see what would be obvious for a consultant or someone from the outside to take a look and identify, but this way they can do that work on their own in-house and at least start to see like, what are these factors, what are these barriers that are impacting specific roles or specific schedules or specific learning or training events to develop people into retained volunteers. And I love your point, Lisa, about what are we asking them to do? Well, they fulfilled the ask. Why are we punishing them or trying to guilt them or like following up in a weird way instead of a positive engagement? Or this is a conversation I just had with Jessica Pang Parks of don't send the thank you and the next ask in the same email. Thank them for what they did for the one-time thing. And then in a separate email, say, if you want to stay connected to this organization, even if you're moving away, if you want a newsletter, then in a separate communication, invite them to stay engaged, but don't try to like guilt dogpile on someone who showed up to a thing and did exactly what you wanted them to do and owes you nothing else because you haven't warmly invited them to do anything else.
It's also, I think, a detriment to your organization to sort of, quote unquote, like punish yourself that somebody did the commitment and then moved away or didn't opt into like another commitment doing something else, because it makes your organization look bad. But if somebody did commit to 6 months, they did the full 50 hours, maybe in that 6 months, they did 60 hours. That's actually a success story. Like, yeah, they left after the 6 months, but they, in that time, they actually did 20% more hours than the commitment was. That's a positive retention story and not a negative retention story, right? So I think it's just like something that people really need to think about a little bit more, and then looking at the individual roles and then looking to see if there are trends and there are actual proven barriers. Like you were saying, in-person training for a remote volunteer role. Well, the reason I applied to this is because my time is wild. I love the idea of remote volunteerism. I am not coming in, like I'm out, like you've lost me before the training because I'm not going to come to an in-person training for a remote role. I wouldn't.
Yeah. And I'm not going to spend the time and the money because it is a serious expense in most urban areas. And I'm beaming in from San Francisco, and this organization was come from anywhere in the Bay Area, pay to cross a bridge, pay to park, pay to be at your training. That's what it amounts to, is an economic pressure, something that they're correcting for the next cohort, fortunately. But tell us more about how this specific tool and the other tool that your group developed, how does it help get that holistic picture? How does it help not just have the raw data that can tell an inaccurate story, quite frankly? Numbers can tell a story, but by themselves, numbers are just nothing. They're numbing. People aren't going to relate to it. So, and like you said, you don't want to accidentally have a number reflect something that isn't really accurate to the function of that volunteer role and the impact it had. Speaking of Sue Carter Kale's thing about it's not just numbers of hours and warm bodies, like what's the real mission impact? What's the measurable result from someone even doing only, which is still a lot, 6 months or 50 or 60 hours of commitment? But what good things happened with the organization because of that? And how does this tool that's for free, all these are for free on VolunteerMatch, and I'll have the links below. How does this tool kind of help solve for what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I'm like, that's a really good question. I'm like looking at the tool. I'm not 100% certain it goes quite that deep. And I think that's like a good piece of feedback for enhancing the tool. I wasn't really focused on, you just blew my mind. Like I wasn't really focused on telling that story of what they did while they were there. I guess a piece of me kind of assumed that was kind of like already being told, like in your general volunteer narratives of like what people are doing while they're volunteering, I guess, but that's a good thing to call out, and an enhancement that can be made. But one of the kind of thing we were looking at again is like, what impact did the volunteerism have on that person that may or may not have been retained, and how are they still retained in the traditional sense of like still doing the work, the volunteerism work, and did they take anything with them? Is that something you might have data on? Like you mentioned sending that second email about them signing up for a newsletter. Well, what's your click-through rate on that? How many people opt into that newsletter? And so it's like, yes, these people, we did have 5% of our volunteers moved away this year, and all 5% of them are now receiving our newsletter and are still like involved in the mission. It's not like they've just completely ghosted and they're like, oh, this opportunity is dead to me. Or that really interesting thing about that conversion rate into being a donor. Like that's really important to a museum. Like if this person isn't volunteering anymore, but they signed up to do even one of your lowest levels, like it's like $20 a year or something like that, is huge that this person had such helpful. An impact of volunteering, that they're still involved in that way. It could also be between roles as well. Thinking about like if you didn't retain them, because this tool is meant to be looked at per role, but you could have a example of somebody who went from doing one role at your organization to another. And using those examples I had earlier of like the 6 months versus like a 1-day volunteerism, you might have somebody who used to do the 6 months, but they got busy and now they do the 1 day. Well, it's not really they only do that 1 day a year now at your event. They love your mission and vision so much, right? That they identified that this commitment was too much for me. I completed it. I still want to stay involved. So I'm now doing this. Like that's actually a positive story that people want to stay involved. And then of course there's the obvious growth story of somebody who might start out as a episodic volunteer at your 1-day event and then became somebody who committed to a larger role. So there are these different stories that you can tell. And I think it was the volunteer management hybrid conference in 2023 that was the data driven one, and they were talking about like what stories is your data telling, right? So you might still want to do some traditional retention data if that's what your leadership wants and they don't want you to define it in a different way. But what are the stories that you're partnering with that? And this worksheet can help you find some of those stories of like, maybe we did lose 15% of our volunteers this year, but all 15 of them, and don't say but, because whatever comes after but, people think is going to be negative.
Yes, and.
Do that.
Yes, so big fans of yes, and.
Yes, we lost 15% of our volunteers this year, and 11% of them are getting our newsletter, and 4% of them are now donating, right? Like of those 15, right? Like that's huge. These are great numbers.
It's a way of measuring engagement in a manner that the vast majority of nonprofits or government agencies or agencies working with volunteers simply do not do, and it doesn't occur to them to do. And I've done videos about it. There's other things on this channel that I'll link to that are about that, and the hybrid conference on data-driven things and retention, and like what Aaron Spink is famous for, like what are we really measuring? And again, Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, what metrics are we measuring, and does it matter? And what does that tell us? What does that tell us about the story? So data storytelling mixed in with that. I also think people can use this tool and others in the toolkit up on VolunteerMatch to, a lot of these tools are designed, especially the ones that my group worked on for kind of planning and advocacy, to make the case to leadership to do things more efficiently, better, just work smarter instead of harder. That's what a little bit of time learning a tool or utilizing it as a tool, as an example, as a template, because they take a lot of different formats in the toolkit. But a worksheet like this at least gets you started on, how are you framing this idea? How are you approaching this in a way that, again, many CVAs and qualified other experts found a way to hone this tool and create this, maybe from some other resources. A lot of the tools are created from scratch. Many of them are adapted from other colleagues with credit. But at least there's this toolkit and this specific tool to think about the retention and the attachment to the role versus, are they still with the organization, but they're cross-training? So is that a false dip in this role just because two people move to a different team? You wouldn't fault a corporation for moving team members around department to department. They wouldn't be like a negative impact on their numbers. Nonprofits need to be run very differently from corporations, but I think we can use data in a way to more effectively get the holistic picture, tell the whole story, get the information in the correct context to understand something beyond net loss, net gain.
And we just need to modernize, quite frankly. I mean,
right, that too.
One of the things I noticed, at my last organization, more specifically, because my current organization, we have volunteers in 106 countries. Like I work for our headquarters, so I don't actually know these particular stats off the top of my head. But when I was at a smaller organization, those volunteers that were getting like our 40-year awards or 50-year awards for volunteerism, that was going away. And a lot of that was sort of a stereotypical, in a sense, like a stay-at-home wife or mother who one day a week, would go to the museum and be at the information desk, and did that every Thursday morning for, 45 years. And that's just not really like the reality of the way society is now.
Yeah, and other generations. Like there are certain generational enculturations, privileges, economic benefits that occurred randomly by where you were born and when you were born, that have been the stereotypes of volunteers, of the like whiter, wealthier, more retired or more financially independent, or the generation of silent generation and boomers in particular that were, stay-at-home parents or housewives or whatever. It's kind of like Mad Men era stereotype of ladies who lunch. And we've been very reliant on a specific aging population for so long without modernizing or changing our approach, without alienating those folks, still valuing that, like, you have decades of experience here, you have a lot of wisdom. To your point, there's a lot of other people out there. And if you make it flexible and remove the barriers to participation and recognize what those are and get out of your own way, you can have a vastly more reflective of the community, everyone feels welcome team of volunteers than a homogenous, certain demographic keeps coming back again and again, because those are the ones who can afford to.
Right. And that's who this sort of stereotypical retention is modeled for, right? Like, but you're not going to have people always. You might still get that. And actually at my current organization, we are for the first time ever designing 30 and 35-year pins, because we've never had
got them
get to that place before, and it's happening. So we're going to make the pins so they can have them. Right. But yeah, we really need to be thinking about, there's more to it, I think, than just sticking and doing the same role over and over again. If they met your minimum commitment at your organization and they got something out of it, and they're still contributing or connected to your mission and vision in some way, that should not take away from your organization's sort of picture of retention. And I think that that's a great buy-in conversation if you decide to go this route and try to make some changes about how you talk about retention and what you share, because really leadership wants to tell a positive story, and these negative stereotypical numbers are not telling a positive story, and they are telling the wrong story, because it's probably better than it looks from those numbers that are just being pulled from how many names aren't coming back this year, or however you would pull those sort of traditional retention numbers. So I think conversations around this and getting buy-in about talking about retention in a different way is something that I think leadership would be attracted to, because it's better for them.
Well, and it gives more accuracy. So everything about data, because we're in a data mining economy. That's not a controversial thing to say. That's how our economy works these days, especially online. And it's clicks and it's eyeballs and it's advertisements and it's, like you said, newsletter. It's what's the percentage of click-throughs? Who's really reading the newsletter? Who's spending 30 seconds and clicking away from it? Where's it just not being opened at all? Open rates. And it also has to do with outdated ideas of what data and metrics what we should be measuring. And there's this saying in data analysis and in general, not just of garbage in, garbage out. You want it to be accurate, whether you have a volunteer management software system that helps you automate some of these things, or you've got spreadsheets or pieces of paper and banker's boxes. You want accurate information to go into whatever you're reporting about. And if you're just using raw numbers, that's just part of the picture. And we want to get that whole picture. And I think this particular tool is helpful. You said your group did 2 tools.
So the other tool that I created with the toolkit is a questionnaire, but it's a volunteer motivational questionnaire. And so something for me personally that I think is a really interesting concept, and I don't know how many people go super deep into it and sort of quote unquote geek out about it like I do, is the motivation behind why people volunteer.
Super important.
I think it's really, really important. And, there was a lot of stress at my last organization about our annual recognition event. Then they would throw all this money at it. And I literally had less than $1 a volunteer during the regular year. And then I would get $30,000 to throw this party.
Can we spread this out?
10% of our volunteers would physically attend the big soiree.
Yeah, not efficient.
And people are why aren't they coming? And I had a volunteer one time who was getting a 20-year pin or something. And he was and that at that level, you go on stage, right? So I'm trying to see who's actually showing up and is going to come and be on stage, because I'm event managing, I'm event planning. You know how it is, volunteer management.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Doing the whole thing.
All the hats.
And he was I'm not coming. And I was what do you mean you're not coming?
Yeah, I don't want to.
Pin. And
yeah,
he's
I don't want
I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care about my 20-year pin.
Mm-hmm.
And he was that's not, I don't do what I do to get the 20-year pin. And so I did go down the rabbit hole. And, I know Toby Johnson has a lot of great things about those sort of top 6, motivations that are out there. And so you really have to diversify the kinds of retention activities you do, thinking about more of that. How do you keep people, right, after they're there, so that you're connecting with people who are in those 6 different buckets, and there's probably some people who are in more than one bucket and spill over. And of course, nothing is super straightforward, being put into buckets or boxes, even though I love putting things into boxes, but there's always spillover. But if you're only giving out pins and there's no other benefit of volunteering, people who are motivated by other factors aren't gonna stick around. Maybe they won't complete their commitment because they're not getting anything else out of this experience while they're going through it. And so the motivational questionnaire was actually based on something I did at my last organization. And I did it for volunteers after they were recruited and they were sort of in the training period, as a way to get to know these people deeper than the interviews, deeper than, just coming to training about why are you here? We created sort of a sample motivational questionnaire about just asking them a bunch of different kinds of questions phrased in different ways. You don't need to use all of these. You can write your own once you're sort of like inspired, or hopefully inspired by what you see. And then, yes, this is definitely something. If you have 10,000 volunteers, you're gonna be like, I'm supposed to give 10,000 volunteers like a motivational questionnaire, because it is open-ended questions. Because again, you're trying to figure out with their own words, like what these people are interested in. When I used that at my last organization, I used it with cohorts that I was recruiting. So I would have like a cohort of like 40 people. They would fill out the questionnaire, and then I would look at these 40 people and sort of see like, okay, what's going on here? What do I need to make sure I'm paying attention to? Oh, these people are really interested in like learning more. There's a lot of trends here that there's a lot of people. So I need to make sure I'm planning in the next couple of months, some professional development opportunities just for volunteers. That's part of like their benefit package for volunteering. And then these people will be like, oh, and then they'll stay more. We just talked about retention. We're not getting those people who are going to be there for 40 years that are going to get the pin with the slightly larger diamond in it or something. And then they get to put it on their lanyard or their vest or something like that. They have this 40-year diamond pin, but there's people who are like, I did this because of the training, the learning. I'm teaching people as part of my volunteer role, but I want to continue learning while I'm here. So making sure you have like a professional development enrichment program for these folks, or really interested in teaching other people. So maybe this is a person that you bring in for opportunities. Like there's this special opportunity where we're doing an after hours thing where kids are coming in and on their questionnaire that they're interested in teaching people, and you're tapping them to do something special that has to do something more with teaching, and just making really people feel appreciated and connecting individually with them on why they're there to keep them. Because once you get people, and you can bucket people and you can try to typecast people, but part of the point of this tool that I was really pushing forward is once you get them in, they are an individual people.
Right. Yeah.
And you might have thought their
Yeah.
motivation was one thing when you brought them in, and then motivations do change over time. So
yeah, it could evolve. They could be more or less motivated by the experience they're having as a good experience or a bad experience. And I know volunteers who stuck with, quite frankly, crappy direct staff supervisors or organizations that were dysfunctional because they loved the clients, they loved their particular team, they loved the work, and they felt they were doing it, making a difference, and it was meaningful to them, even if the organization was often dismissive. Or the fact is that most people aren't going to push through demotivation like that. The vast majority are not going to keep putting up with BS or feeling unvalued, not heard, disrespected, unwelcome in ways. And that's really the point of the toolkit. It's gone through a rebranding when we were working on it. And I want to make sure that this point is really clear, because this is something that's impacting the entire sector right now with the current administration in 2025. Is, as we were working on this, it was called the Equity in Action Toolkit, and it's been loaded up, and some tools, like you mentioned, are, and I know of some others that are still in development, still being done. It was the Equity in Action Toolkit, living on VolunteerMatch, hosted for free. Anyone can download it. And again, the tools are, we listen to feedback. It's a living process. They'll be adjusted. But because of executive orders against DEI and things that are coming out that may or may not be legal or constitutional, but organizations that receive a lot of federal grant funding are kind of really being censored or forced to comply with different language, the toolkit will be rebranded, not really changed fundamentally, just a couple of rewordings here and there, and is called, what I think Pfizer very wisely framed as kind of the core question to all of this work that we've been doing since last year, which is everyone welcome, ? So it's the everyone welcome toolkit, and then the individual tools work on, in your case, retention, in my case, advocacy. Other people were talking about mentorship and onboarding and screening. There were other different specialties or buckets that the toolkits were in. We really put a lot into this, and these are valuable tools for leaders of volunteers from anywhere, doing anything. They're deliberately designed to be as easy to use and to plug and play for any variety of situations, not just animal welfare or not just, museums and zoos or conservation, but even if they're derived from models that were from specific parts of the sector, they're genuinely useful so that everyone can understand the motivations of volunteers, why recruitment retention might be off, how you can make the case to leadership about, improving policies so everyone can work better and smarter together and more efficiently and have accurate data. You can continue to do good work where everyone does feel welcome.
Yeah, and I think there was also some mention of also referring to it as sort of a broadening volunteer engagement toolkit as
Exactly.
well.
Yeah. Broadening
And
engagement.
it's really just about holistic thinking. And one of the things that I think is a really important concept that I like to keep in mind with my work just in general, and that everyone should, is universal design. We need to look at things differently, and we need to continue to look at things differently. This toolkit probably would be even more beneficial if we put it on some sort of like cycle of review every 3 years. The toolkit is reviewed, people are brought back in, and we continue to grow and learn and enhance our practice. The literal definition of insanity is doing something the same way over and over again and expecting different results. So we should not be doing that, and we should always be learning and growing and always refining our tools. Like I said earlier, you brought up a really good point. Like I was like, oh dang, we should have a line on the defining retention worksheet talking about like what the accomplishments were of the volunteers that year. If it's not, quote unquote, like I said, like, oh, I thought maybe people were already talking about that, I should be making assumptions, right?
So Lisa, is there anything else that you want to share with other leaders of volunteers? The Priceless Advice audience, we've covered a lot of great stuff, including the couple of tools that you helped develop for the Everyone Welcome toolkit.
I am one of the facilitators for ALIVE's National Networks Community of Practice. We're always looking to grow that. And also, if you're not part of a national network, but it's something you're interested in, you want to meet other people, we definitely, with ALIVE, you don't have to necessarily be part of that community to join that community of practice if it's a content area you're interested in. But we are a pretty small group, so I'm always shamelessly sort of plugging the national network. When I transitioned roles from, I was working in a museum into my national network, the first thing I did was to look for the resources ALIVE had to help guide me, like as I transitioned roles. I know how to be a volunteer manager, but it was a completely different realm. And the National Network Community of Practice has been really invaluable, and I'm really excited to be sort of stepped up now to be co-facilitating that and keeping that group going. So you can sign up for that on the ALIVE website if you're a ALIVE member or not. So that's one place you can find me, and I am on LinkedIn as well.
On the LinkedIn's, and I'm always here. I'm a past president of ALIVE. I joined the board in 2013. I did a 6-year term, which is the max out.
Oh, wow.
And I'm still on the membership committee, and I'm still doing video editing projects and whatever other promos, and whatever time I have that I can donate to promoting ALIVE, Association of Leaders in Volunteer Engagement, our professional network in the USA, although we do have some good sneaky Canadians in our association as well. And the website is volunteeralive.org. And again, I'll have links to ALIVE and the toolkit and the LinkedIn profile, so you can also connect with Lisa Marie. I'm so glad to have you on here talking about the importance of these tools, specifically for retention and getting the big picture on that. And thank you so much, Lisa Marie Mooney, MA CVA, for being back on Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers and offering up your awesome Tuesday tips. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.